Feasting in Rus was a beloved and well-practiced tradition. Legends were told about the royal banquets, where heroic feats often began. The grandest feasts were held by Boris Godunov. One of his banquets, celebrating a victory in war, lasted for 6 weeks, and an astonishing 500,000 guests attended, with food transported in convoys. But why did foreign ambassadors and Russian boyars alike fear invitations to royal feasts in Rus? Why did they try to hide at the table? What would surprise you unpleasantly in the royal chambers? Why did guests have to share a spoon and plate with their neighbor? Which royal dishes would shock you? The manners of Russian aristocrats, who passed gas and used foul language, would certainly unsettle you. So, today, we find ourselves in the year 1644. This is Irina, a genuine tsarevna, the daughter of the first tsar from the Romanov dynasty. She is a purple-born tsarevna, a term used for children born to the tsar after he ascended the throne. The tsar has decided to marry off his daughter to Danish Prince Valdemar. Danish envoys have arrived for the occasion, and a grand feast is starting in the palace. Imagine you are heading to the feast at the Tsar's court in a new sarafan, embroidered with gold and precious stones. You see the admiring glances of the boyars and tremble with excitement at the prospect of being presented to the Tsar himself. How does that scene sound to you? Well, such a scene would be impossible in Rus. If you were a woman, you would have no chance to sit at the banquet table in the royal chambers, not even if you were the Tsarina or a purple-born Tsarevna. From the 15th to 16th century onwards, women of the upper class in Rus were subject to strict rules borrowed from Byzantium. The Tsarina lived in a separate part of the palace, and it was absolutely forbidden for strangers, especially men, to see her. Her court consisted only of women, except for a few pages under the age of 10. Tsarinas and Tsarevnas could only attend wedding feasts, and for the rest, they could only peek through special windows. However, Tsarinas held their own feasts exclusively for female company. Similarly, boyar wives and daughters were confined to women's quarters. Commoner women, not bound by such rules, were much freer. So, it's clear that women were absent from the feast. Our heroine, the purple-born Tsarevna Irina, could only observe the feast through a special window. Let's move to the table. First, there was definitely no red or black caviar on the Tsar's table in Russia until the 19th century. Caviar wasn't particularly valued and was mainly eaten by the indigenous peoples of the north. An Amour trade publication from the early 20th century noted, as late as 1907, masses of caviar were discarded along with fish waste, and only a small portion was prepared for the Russian market. Perhaps in earlier times, caviar was eaten in Rus? A 17th century resident of Moscow wrote, "The Muscovites have red caviar, lightly salted." So, caviar did exist, but wasn't considered a delicacy and was more commonly consumed by monks, townsfolk, and small traders, certainly not by the nobility. Boyars might have occasionally eaten black caviar, but it wasn't considered a delicacy or even particularly tasty. It was said that eating it was like dining with the devil because this useless food filled the mouth with salt and the nose with a toxic aroma. So, there was no place for red or black caviar on the Tsar's table. And what kind of delicacy is it anyway when, until the late 18th century, red fish was found in the Moscow River? The Antiochian patriarch Macarius, who visited Moscow several times in the 17th century, wrote, "The Moscow River flows from west to east and is full of different kinds of fish. One kind always has a belly full of very tasty red caviar." But the patriarch was a foreign guest, and Russians didn't appreciate caviar. However, eggplant caviar could indeed be found on the Tsar's table during the early Romanov period. Eggplants originated from India, and eggplant caviar came to Russia from Iran in the 17th century and was considered a true delicacy. So, what was served at the Tsar's feast? A Russian feast began with cold appetizers, pickles, smoked meats. Then stewards brought in roasted swans and peacocks with feathers, up to 300 of them. Next came huge carcasses on spits, so large that 10 men could barely carry them. A real delicacy was roasted lynx or a pig's carcass roasted on one side and boiled on the other, stuffed with birds and vegetables. How they prepared this is unknown, as the recipe has been lost. Foreigners were astonished by geese stuffed with buckwheat and cuckoos roasted in honey. However, you probably wouldn't want to try some of the other delicacies, such as geese baked with leeches, sheep heads, or pig tails. Of course, there were also sterlet, sturgeon, and various other fish delicacies at the feast. Then came the various pies, of which there were many kinds. Unlike today, soups, now considered a first course, were served almost at the very end of the feast, just before dessert. Dessert was the crowning glory of the royal chefs. A sugar Kremlin complete with towers, people on the streets, horsemen, churches, and chambers, replicated exactly as they appeared in reality, could weigh up to 80 kilograms. In addition to the Kremlin, they brought in gilded trees with sweets hanging in place of fruit, sweet pastries, buns, and gingerbread, the list goes on. Up to 500 dishes were served at the table. The sheer amount of food made foreigners fear attending Russian feasts. These feasts could last 10 or even 20 hours. Imagine eating nearly nonstop for an entire day. As we mentioned earlier, the record-breaking feast during Godunov's reign lasted a whopping 6 weeks. Even at the most ordinary feasts, there were 25 types of ukka, fish soup, and over 100 meat dishes. Counting the different kinds of pies would be impossible. The main rule of a successful feast was that the number of dishes must far exceed the number of guests. It was customary to at least taste a little bit of each dish. People overate so much at these feasts that they could hardly breathe. Special servants were provided to help guests who had eaten themselves into a stupor. These guests were taken to a special room where they were given a pheasant feather to tickle their throats and induce vomiting, making room for more food. There were also special trestles where they could lie on their stomachs with their heads hanging down to empty their stomachs and return to the table. For Europeans, this abundance of food was shocking. After such a feast, where they ate for 12 to 20 hours straight, the Tsar might still send the French ambassador, for example, a meal of 40 pounds of smoked beef, half a piglet, 12 dishes of fish fried in walnut oil, a bottle of vodka, mead, and Spanish wine. This was for him to finish what he hadn't managed to eat at the feast. Another Russian tradition that made foreign diplomats cringe was the Tsar sending dishes he had tasted from his table to the Russian boyars. This was a sign of royal favor. The boyars took pride in this honor and would finish everything, even licking the plate clean. However, the ambassadors didn't like this tradition, so it was decided to send them not leftovers, but dishes that had simply been on the main table for a bit. Moreover, the food in Rus was quite distinctive. Garlic was highly favored and added in large quantities to almost everything, as it was considered a remedy for many illnesses. Even beer was infused with garlic. Foreigners claimed that this unpleasant smell permeated even the royal chambers. Gavril Uspensky, in his treatise An Attempt to Narrate Russian Antiquities, wrote that European ambassadors disliked Russian cuisine and found it repulsive due to the strong garlic onion smell or the unpleasant odor of hemp seed oil or poorly prepared cow butter, which was used in all flour dishes, pies, and fried fish. Russian ghee would also not appeal to you. It smoked when cooked, and they rendered it daily to prevent spoilage. As a result, this butter had a bitter burnt taste instead of the familiar buttery flavor. It was truly a rare nastiness. Another interesting detail is that meat was roasted without salt or spices. As noted by a clerk of the ambassadorial office, without seasonings, without berries, sugar, and without pepper and ginger and other methods. Salt and spices were placed on the table for guests to add according to their own taste. The most challenging aspect of the Tsars feast for us to get used to would be the lack of individual utensils. The first English ambassador to Russia, Anthony Jenkinson, was shocked by the lavish golden dishes at the Russian feast and estimated that the 2 goblets, casually passed around by the revelers, were worth a staggering £400 sterling. Another Englishman, Giles Fletcher, couldn't believe his eyes when he counted 300 attendants at the table, dressed in golden and silver brocade. Imagine the shock of foreigners when they saw the Tsar eating at a golden table. Despite over 100 golden dishes on the table, there were no napkins at all. Instead, cabbage leaves were placed on the table for wiping grease off fingers. Foreign diplomats wrote that the boyars wiped their mouths with their clothing or simply their hands and blew their noses directly onto the floor. Incidentally, in medieval Europe, knights were also instructed to blow their noses onto the floor. Devout individuals wiped their dirty hands on their long beards, preserving the smell of the feast until their next visit to the bathhouse. Another detail of the lavish Tsarist feasts was that 1 spoon and 1 dish were shared between 2 people. Prince Daniel of Bucho mentioned that during a feast at Ivan the Terrible's court, he had to share a knife and plate with his neighbor. Therefore, many Russians brought their own spoons and knives, which they carried on their belts. A typical Russian feast looked like this. 2 or 3 people sitting next to each other would take food from large plates with their hands, eat, smack their lips, and even lick their fingers. Soup was always served in a single bowl for 2 people, and it was expected to be eaten alternately. Sharing a dish with someone was considered an honor, especially if it was with someone older. Refusing to share a dish was an insult. Once, at the Tsar's table, the Bishop of Ryazan was so offended that the Archbishop of Rostov did not let him eat from the same dish that he submitted a complaint to the Tsar himself. Forks, on the other hand, are believed to have first appeared in Russia at the wedding feast of Marina Nisik and False Dmitri in 1606. However, this seems odd, considering that in Byzantium, from which Russia often borrowed customs, forks had been in use since the 11th century. Furthermore, archaeologists have found a 14th century fork in Veliki Novgorod. In contrast, forks only became popular in England in the 18th century. As for the Tsar's chambers, you might think they were the height of luxury. You'd be shocked to learn that they were quite the opposite. You would be struck, to put it mildly, by the minimalism of the Kremlin's chambers, specifically their furnishings. Let's look at them through the eyes of the English sailor Richard Chancellor, who had been to the courts of both the Valois and the Tudors. He was impressed by Moscow, which was much larger than London. However, the Tsar's chambers in the Kremlin greatly disappointed him. When Chancellor was invited to a feast in the Golden Chambers in his honor, he was ready for anything but what he saw. The Golden Chambers, to the Englishman, looked almost like a hovel. The furnishings included a large heating stove and simple, unpainted benches and tables, akin to those found in Italian inns. This description comes from another foreigner, the Italian aristocrat Raphael Barberini, who attended a feast at Ivan the Terrible's court. To us, such furnishings would seem, at the very least, uncomfortable and extremely sparse. This is because even the chambers in the Tsar's palace retained the typical setup of a Russian izba, including its furniture, which meant benches. However, the Kremlin's carpets were luxurious. Raphael Barberini also noted a buffet in the middle of the hall, filled with numerous golden and silver dishes. What really stunned the Englishman Chancellor was the Tsar himself and the opulence of his and his courtiers' attire. The Tsar was simply dazzling. Many foreign diplomats wrote about this. They also noted that his crown and luxurious clothing, embroidered with precious stones, surpassed the splendor of anything they had seen at other courts and even that of the Pope himself. The Tsar's grandeur was one thing, but foreigners were also shocked by the opulence of the Russian courtier's clothing. All this splendor in pearls, furs, and precious stones left them astounded. They didn't know that such luxurious attire was loaned to the boyars for the occasion, and after the feast, they had to return everything unsoiled and without any damage. So, our heroine's chosen suitor was Danish Prince Valdemar Christian, Count of Schleswig-Holstein. He had visited for the first time 3 years ago, and the Russian Tsar had become very fond of him, wanting him to become his son-in-law at all costs. The groom was also impressed by the bride's beauty. But there was one detail they needed to discuss. Meanwhile, our heroine observed the groom through a special window. He was given a great honor, sitting at the same table as the Tsar and the Tsarevich. Such an extraordinary honor was bestowed upon very few. You might think that seating arrangements at a feast were simple, just take a seat on the benches, right? No, you would certainly get confused here. Seats on the benches were not equal. At Tsarist feasts, this was a huge issue that could end in the loss of an estate and freedom. As mentioned earlier, the Tsar's chambers were like a Russian izba, where all seats were assigned by seniority. The most honorable places were to the right of the Tsar at the large, so-called straight table. Less prestigious places were at the so-called crooked table. Additionally, seats on the bench by the wall were better and more honorable than those on the outer side of the table. According to Raphael Barberini, the tables were very different. One was tall, another short, narrow, or wide. Depending on the seat, a guest's menu was also different. Each guest's place at the tables was strictly regulated by their nobility and ancestry. Sitting in a seat meant for someone of higher nobility was a serious insult. Conversely, taking a lower place than one deserved was a disgrace and dishonor. As a result, for instance, the Queen's relatives did not attend feasts at all since sitting below someone else was shameful and sitting higher was inappropriate. Unfortunate boyars or nobles who were placed below their status would go to great lengths to avoid the feast. If they failed and the Tsar ordered them to be seated forcibly, they resisted in every way, even declaring they would sit under someone only under the threat of death. Such disputes over seating at feasts could end very badly for the keepers of lineage honor. They could be imprisoned, beaten, or stripped of their title and all possessions. However, lineage honor compelled them to continue causing scandals over seating. But let's return to our heroine. The problem hindering her marriage was that the prince was a Lutheran and steadfastly refused to convert to Orthodoxy, while Patriarch Joseph insisted that without this, there would be no wedding. The matter had to be resolved soon. And our Tsarevna, in love with the prince since childhood, observed his servants' faces, wondering why some of them constantly grimaced. If you imagine the gallant Russian boyars with long beards having dignified conversations, prepare for a shock. Here's what foreign diplomats wrote. They are not at all ashamed, in full view and without sparing anyone's sense of smell, to release what nature demands after a meal. And since they love and eat plenty of onions and garlic, their very presence is unbearably oppressive to the unaccustomed. Augustin Meyerberg, in his travels, also noted, during the meal, they suddenly burst into the loudest belching, accompanied by the repulsive smell of undigested garlic, onions, radishes, and vodka. This belching, mingling with the loud emissions from their stomachs, surrounds those nearby with the most noxious sulfurous stench. Jacob Reitenfels said, "They have no polite and elegant manners whatsoever. They don't even consider it improper to speak rudely, hiccup, belch, and do even more disgusting things during formal gatherings." But in reality, Russians burp genuinely, wanting to please their guests. This was part of the Russian dining etiquette. In many cultures, burping signifies satisfaction and gratitude to the host for the meal. This is how it was perceived in Japan, China, and India. Eastern Slavs believed that burping was a way for the soul to communicate with God. Daniil, Prince of Buchov, the ambassador from the Holy Roman Empire to the Russian Tsardom during Ivan the Terrible's reign, noted an interesting detail. Burping was considered a sign of sophistication among Russians. The same went for passing gas. Dining etiquette allowed for that as well. Some modern researchers also link passing gas with sexuality in Russia. These were the customs. Interestingly, similar norms existed not only in Russia but also in Europe. So it's not entirely clear why foreign diplomats were so outraged. For instance, the renowned German theologian Martin Luther believed that a loud release of gas was the best way to drive away evil spirits. One can understand their reaction, but it's doubtful you would appreciate such manners. Another thing that would likely shock you is the amount of alcohol you would be expected to drink at a czarist feast. Foreign diplomats were equally appalled. Here's how the feast hosted by Ivan III was described by Ambassador Ambrogio Contarini. I was presented with a large silver cup full of honey drink and was told that the Tsar commanded me to drink it all and gifted me the cup. Such a custom is observed only in cases of showing the highest honor to either an ambassador or someone else. However, it proved difficult for me to drink such a large quantity, as there was an enormous amount of drink. It was not uncommon for ambassadors to get so drunk they could not perform their duties. To quote, ambassadors, delighted by the Tsar's favor, got so drunk they soon left the chambers in a stupor. After the meal, they were supposed to present the Tsar's gifts, sable fur, and deliver a speech and documents. But the gifts and documents were not presented because the ambassadors were too drunk. Foreigners devised various tricks to handle the situation. Those who didn't want to get drunk had to either pretend to be drunk or asleep, outdrink the Russians, or outright declare they couldn't drink anymore. It wasn't uncommon at the Tsar's table for guests to hastily leave the feast in a drunken haze or even run off, not waiting for the end of the ceremony. Drinking began before the meal, with strong drinks being served. As a result, many could not handle it and fell off their chairs even before the feast began, since there were no appetizers. The story of the Czech ambassador, who fainted after tasting the Tsar's aperitifs, was remembered at court for a long time. After this, foreigners were served the same amount of alcohol as the Russians. This fact no longer satisfied the foreigners. Raphael Barberini recalled, "We sat at the table for more than 3 hours, where we drank little. However, there was a lot of noise around the drinking. Quite a few of the boyars got thoroughly drunk. In general, it was extremely difficult for foreign diplomats tasked with portraying Russians as wild barbarians to please them. So what did they drink at czarist feasts? They served dozens of varieties of meat at these banquets, from lingonberry to juniper. Among imported wines, Rhine wine, Rhenish wine, and muscat were especially prized. But Ivan the Terrible himself drank vodka. However, the Tsar was not fond of drunkenness. Vodka was diluted with water to 17 degrees when served in his presence. They also drank sour shkai at the feasts. This was a highly carbonated alcoholic beverage based on honey and malt, known since the 16th century. It could be prepared with raisins, black currants, raspberries, and hops were added to the honey. After a few days of fermentation, this original drink was ready. Sour shkai was stored in bottles with very thick glass, as others could easily explode. At the feasts, a vessel known as a bratina was filled with wine and passed around so everyone could take a sip. You might not have liked this custom, considering the hygiene and the number of infectious diseases of the time. Additionally, you would probably have been exhausted. Russian feasts, according to eyewitness accounts, resembled a gym. Guests often stood up, toasted to the health of the Tsar and his close ones, drank moderately, and then sat down again. This could happen up to 100 times during a feast. One foreigner wrote, "This ceremony happened so often that, instead of being fully satisfied, my appetite increased hour by hour." Here's how another foreigner described their departure from the Tsar's feast. "Immediately after, both the ambassadors and I were quite drunk. Forgetting all decency and modesty, we all rushed out the door." Such haste might not have been seen even among scribes and Pharisees leaving the temple. Foreigners often describe Russian customs with exaggerated disgust. Yet similar customs existed in medieval Europe. There, it was common to provide a basin at feasts where everyone could wash their hands. And gallant knights were advised, at the table, it is improper to stick fingers in ears or eyes, and even more so to pick one's nose during the meal. These three habits are considered deceitful. Throwing a gnawed bone on the floor was allowed. Blowing one's nose into the tablecloth was prohibited, but into a sleeve was acceptable. Food was also served on communal dishes. Sometimes there was one plate for two people, but more often, there wasn't a plate at all. Instead, there was a piece of stale bread. Europeans also brought their own spoons and knives to the feast. Wine vessels were shared with neighbors. Only by the 17th century did both Europeans and Russians start using individual tableware. Special embroidered napkins for hands were introduced. Our heroine, however, was still unaware that the Danish prince categorically refused to change his faith. Diplomats began to extol the virtues of Princess Irina to him. She was a smart and modest young woman who had never been drunk in her life. So how did the story of the Russian princess and Danish prince Waldemar end? After long theological debates lasting a year, Waldemar steadfastly refused to convert to orthodoxy. Our Irina, deeply in love with the prince, took this very hard. Seeing his daughter's suffering, the Tsar grew angry with the Danish prince and forbade him from leaving Russia. Waldemar, along with several knights, attempted to escape but was detained. The prince was placed under guard. Danish ambassadors tried to help him flee, but to no avail. The prince was only saved by the Tsar's death. Irina's brother ascended to the throne and allowed Waldemar to return to his homeland. He left without even saying goodbye to his 18-year-old fiancée. Irina never married, and the Danish prince never wed. 11 years later, our heroine learned that her former suitor had died. He had gone to Poland, where he perished in battle at the age of 33.